Okay, test 4 moves into the New Deal. We're struggling with depression. What does this look like? So here comes some answers, and then we move on into World War II. Two things to remind you of. Number one, this is not going to be all-inclusive, so make sure and read your book. Number two, they are doing a ton of work outside my office, and so there's lawnmowers and weed eaters and all those sort of things making tons of noise. I waited as long as I could to make these recordings, so Lord willing, this won't be too much of a problem. And do keep in mind, I'm going through my notes. If I keep looking down, that's all we're doing. So let's start on page 441, and we're talking about this New Deal. As we get into this particular material, there's obviously going to be some terms that some of them you know, some of them are completely new to you, but the New Deal is one that you'll want to know. This is referring to FDR or Franklin Delano Roosevelt's flurry of legislation that he puts up in hopes of pulling the United States out of the Great Depression. For the most part, what we are teaching you in junior high and high school is that this worked. This was this great fix for the Depression, but the reality is that this was not a fix-all situation. He put us into a fair amount of debt, although he was very cautious with that. He didn't want to do anything that put us into debt, and finally realized, I've got to spend money to make this happen. But he also was what your book calls a moderate reformer, and so he didn't want to overstep what he saw as bounds of the executive office. Now, in this terminology, you also need to know the first 100 days. This is terminology that should be familiar to you as we even talk about it today. The news talks about the first 100 days of Obama being in office. What did he do? The idea here is that someone is being put under a microscope for those first 100 days. Not to say it's not happening every single day, as we all know, but there's sort of this benchmark that happens at 100 days with presidents based on good old Roosevelt, because he set in motion so much effort just in that short amount of time that from that point forward, media and individuals are looking for the president to make a big impact in a short amount of time. So his first 100 days is the first of his 3 stages of economic effort to try and change things. He is incredibly talented on so many levels. Roosevelt is a gifted communicator. He is a really good people person. He is also going to be this guy that knows his limitations. Now, as with most presidents you'll probably see or maybe know about from other venues, they are usually, they have a fair amount of competence, and they know that. And I don't mean to say they're egotistical, but they definitely know that they are fit for that office, or feel that way anyway. And Roosevelt's one of these guys, but Roosevelt very much so sees that the problem that the country is struggling with is larger than just, problem. This is a huge issue that the country needs to deal with, and so he brings with him tons of people that he sees as experts on the individual issues that led us to the Depression and thus would hopefully get us out of it. The first thing he does is the 4-day bank holiday, and this banking holiday is really the first order of business for him. He sees this as the big thing that has to be done. Now, what I kind of like about Roosevelt is he recognizes this is a pretty big deal. Not just the banks, but what his call to duty is. And so when he takes office, most often we hear presidents, they're sworn in, and then there's this big hoopla and party. Roosevelt forgoes all that. He goes straight to work, and we see a number of days where they basically do nothing. Him and this brain trust, they come together. All they do is work. How do we fix this problem? And one of the first options they come up with is this bank holiday. In this, they propose the emergency banking relief bill, and this is going to close these, give them some time to hopefully come up with a solution. They did not reopen the banks until Monday, March 13th, and at this point, banks now, they're not under government control, so to speak, but rather they are now backed by the government. In this time, Roosevelt also takes to the radio airwaves most Americans have some form of a radio in their home. Much like today, we have several televisions in our house. I don't know about yours, which is really embarrassing just to say it. Now I want to count. I think I have 3 or 4. Ugh, way too many for such a small family. But as I say, this is very common during this time period to have at least one radio. This is the family entertainment in many ways. This is how they get their news. This is how they get their entertainment. This is how they get so much of their information. And so Roosevelt takes advantage of that and does something called the fireside chats. And you want to know that for your test. He has this incredible ability and his wonderful communication skills to kind of convey this sense of it's going to be okay. And I'm the guy that's going to make that happen. He does this very, very well. You can read a little bit more about what happens with these particular efforts in regards to the bank in that intro. You also see some information about Prohibition and the impact it has on the American culture, but also on the economy. One of the first things he does is he sets up the CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps. Now, this is actually very, very interesting as far as these young men going to work. They're going to make a little bit of money. And they're going to send most of it home. They're taken care of. Their clothes are provided for. Their lodging is provided for. Their food's provided. So all these things. So they send most of the money home. And these young men aren't looking for a handout. They really are looking for a way up. And so the CCC provides that. The first enlistee, your book tells you, is Fiore Rizzo, And it's supposed to be a relief program that's going to help these workers, these young men, to provide a better life for those around them. Usually these are young men. We see about 3 million of them enlist and be a part of this. They are signing up for 6 months of service, and they do a number of different public works that really, a lot of people would go, well, that's what you spent your money on, Roosevelt? But really, it was just to get Americans back to work. What he does is he helps with the CCC. They constructed 140,000 miles of roads and trails. They fought fires. They built rustic lodges, bridges, fire towers, campgrounds, museums, caves, all these different things to get America out of their homes, help them have something else to do. They made a number of improvements to national parks. Also in this time period, Roosevelt is dealing with the dollar. Now we hear that on the news as well. This idea that what's the American dollar doing in the world? Well, this is something that he deals with in a number of ways. The first way is the National Industrial Recovery Act, the NIRA, and you want to know that for your test. This is a larger umbrella organization which ends up creating the National Recovery Administration. Roosevelt saw this as a very important part of the New Deal. It's supposed to move prices back up and put people back to work. Now, prices going back up means that more people are going to need to have more money, but that's going to also drive the production. A lot of things that are going to impact the economy at large. The NRA uses a little bit of a propaganda idea with the Blue Eagle poster, which you see that on page 446. This is to identify companies, storefronts, restaurants, etc., that are a part of this, to encourage Americans to be a part of this effort, to encourage American economy. So if you didn't see the Blue Eagle in a restaurant's window, maybe go down a few doors and you'll find one that does support this. And it really did work quite a bit. The struggle here, as with many of the New Deal policies, is you're having people. And that seems a little pessimistic on my end, but that's what we see time and again. You have somebody that maybe rises too far to power, they take advantage of that power, and in response, they're going to not take care of the people the way they should. And we see a little bit of that with Hugh Iron Pants Johnson. What a name, right? Initially, he does a really good job, but he is somewhat of a problem because he becomes a little too forceful, and he's not really standing up for the little people. Instead, he's standing up for the large corporations. Another one of the New Deal pieces of legislation is the PWA, or the Public Works Administration. Another you'd want to know for your test. It is run by Harold Ickes, known for building projects all over the country, roads, schools, courthouses, hospitals. They're known for the Lincoln Tunnel, LaGuardia Airport, the DC Zoo, Gold Depository of Fort Knox. I mean, there's tons. You can see all that listed on page 447, 448. These are incredible works that wouldn't have probably been built otherwise. So the PWA plays a large role in that. They also are the ones that build the Grand Coulee Dam for the Columbia River. Now, this is going to serve a number of different roles. Most importantly, we certainly see that it's going to help with water reservoirs and giving water to the people in that area, as well as electricity for the Pacific Northwest. It also is going to deal with some problems with, or it's going to kind of open up, probably a better way of saying it. It's going to open up the understanding that there's some problems on a very ground level basis, that Americans need ways to pay for their homes. And with that, we see the development of the FHA, Federal Housing Administration, still in existence today. It's going to offer long-term mortgages with lower payment requirements. Now, the reason this is so important is because we are in a time period with the New Deal and the Depression that a lot of Americans can't afford their homes, and so they are just walking away from them. In the gray area, you see a kind of a continuation of what we talked about with the intro from the last week. This is about FDR and his dealing with the bonus marchers. He really is very considerate of their feelings, particularly Eleanor. She is very focused on helping our vets. It's just unfortunate that they can't do what the vets need because they don't have the money to do so. Or at least that's Roosevelt's impression. All right, chapter 4 starts on page 450, and you see the introduction of the TVA, or the Tennessee Valley Authority. This is going to do similar to the Grand Coulee Dam as far as dealing with water. It's also going to help with electricity in poverty-stricken Appalachia. And this is a section of the world, or a section of the country that many of you probably aren't all that familiar with. It's going to deal mostly with West Virginia and eastern Tennessee. These are heavily depressed areas. People are living without electricity, without clean water, without facilities that most of us take for granted. And so the TVA is going to create an opportunity for these people to hopefully have some true kind of moving forward opportunities. It's also going to provide flood control, which is a massive problem in that area. It passed in May of 1933 and provided electricity for many portions of this countryside for the very first time. We also see the Agricultural Adjustment Act on page 451. It is to make the government a major player in the commodities market so they can reduce the amount of farm goods produced annually. Even today, we see that farmers are paid to not grow certain crops so that they can control what's in front of them. It's going to focus on overproduction in hopes of stabilizing the market. You also see the CWA, the Civil Works Administration, on page 452. It's trying to put those unemployed people back to work. We have 2.6 men that go to work. They're doing manual labor. Again, they're working on roads, they're working on schools, restroom facilities, playgrounds, etc. They are essentially a short-term project for Roosevelt's New Deal. As far as, this is where your book kind of stops and says, okay, this all sounds good, but it's not fixing the greater problem. Many voices are calling for Roosevelt to do so much more. And in 1934, he ends up basically backing off of his effort to not go into debt, to maintain a balanced budget, realizes I have to spend more. So he creates this strategy where he is going to meet the Depression head-on with massive government spending. One of the first parts of that is the Works Progress Administration, and this is eventually renamed the Works Projects Administration. $5 billion funneled into this. 3.5 million Americans are working for it. Again, they're improving hospitals, airports, schools, playgrounds, very hands-on manual labor kind of work. But there's also another component to it where Americans that aren't hands-on labor kind of guy. This is also for artists, actors, writers, photographers, musicians that can go out and capture America. This is where Jackson Pollock becomes famous, as well as many, many others. It's going to employ these people, these artists, to go out, capture America, and try and hopefully A, put these people to work, but B, also illustrate this time period for America. Your book talks about musicians working as folk performers, brass bands, cowboy balladeers. It seems strange that the American government would pay these people to do it, but they would go city to city singing their songs about how great America is. And so that's a large part of it. They are also, photographers particularly, are part of a project called I've Seen America. They shot 27,000 photographs. Now to us, that's not many. If I open up my camera and look at how many pictures I have on it, I don't know that it's 27,000, but it's ridiculous. But what we see here, obviously, they're trying to capture the right picture at the right time because they don't have digital. They're taking one picture in hopes of capturing the picture. And we have some gorgeous photographers really capturing the landscape of America. And a lot of times, your book calls it out. Many of those pictured were framed as survivors of the Great Depression. You also see a theater project, a writer's project. All of these things are part of that I've Seen America and the WPA. Unfortunately, what we see is a lot of Americans are kind of growing weary of this because what's happening is so many men are employed by this, particularly those hands-on, blue-collar, hard-working laborers, that are sometimes, there's so many of them that there's not enough work. And so Americans are seeing them leaning on shovels and getting frustrated with that. One of the largest efforts that those hands-on laborers did was a part of the Statue of Liberty. They were retooling it, they're cleaning it up, they're refurbishing it, and there's a little bit more about that on page 455. On page 456, it talks about that second 100 days. Now, we don't talk about that quite as much today as we did back then, but this was so much of what Roosevelt was about as far as he had to keep moving because the Depression wasn't over. The WPA was probably the high point of his New Deal legislation, but we see that it's not enough. A lot of Americans, as I said, are frustrated with it. You've got the NRA, that National Recovery Administration, the AAA, or the Agricultural Adjustment Agency, but we also see some of his greatest critics come out of the woodwork right now. One of which is Huey Long. He's a senator from Louisiana. He's frustrated with Roosevelt as well as Reverend Conklin and Dr. Townsend. These guys are going to speak out about different aspects of the New Deal legislation and basically try to call Roosevelt on the carpet about it, that he should be doing something more. Each of them focused on something different, but for your study guide, you've got Townsend on there. He ends up basically pitching what we later know as Social Security. And essentially, he calls it the Old Age Revolving Pensions Limited. And he's basically saying that people over 60 should not still work. They should have paid into a program that government will give them the money after they retire, $200 a month, where they could retire, and hopefully this would end up feeding the economy. In the meantime, Roosevelt and his men had been working on something very similar in the Social Security bill. We also see something being called the Wagner Act. This is proposed or presented by Robert F. Wagner. It's supposed to replace the NIRA regarding labor as far as trying to deal with labor unions. Specifically, the problem here is that we don't need to see companies shutting down. That's not helping the economy, so let's help regulate that with government intervention. The Social Security bill, you do need to know that for your test. Look on page 458 for more information about that. We also see that during this time period, a lot of the New Deal programs start being called into question legally. One way we see that happening is the Schnechter Poultry Corporation versus United States. Now, you need to know this for your test. This is also known as the sick chicken case. The Schnechter brothers had not abided by the rules of the NRA, and they were accused of connecting they were accused of problems with pricing and wage fixing. And so these brothers end up going to court trying to deal with the government. Should the government be involved in what they're doing? Is there any reason for this? And what happens is essentially some of Roosevelt's problems get made worse because the Supreme Court, says, we're not going to back you up on this, Roosevelt. You've gone too far. And so we see several of the New Deal legislation pieces being marked or taken down during this time period. You also are introduced to the terminology of the Dust Bowl on page 461. This is that gale force wind that runs across the plains that are moving farm fields that have been overused, not properly rotated. These are overplowed, overgrazed, and you see soil being picked up and moved hundreds of miles across the United States. And we'll stop there and pick up with Chapter 6.